Welcome to Pulse Exchange and to this extremely grandly titled event, A New World Order, question mark. Some of you I know were planning to come before we rescheduled this event, and there are lots of wags who noticed that the previous event had been cancelled. So the New World Order is now cancelled. We have two absolutely brilliant people with us this evening to discuss this topic. George Magnus is Senior Economic Advisor at UBS. As most of you know, he's probably one of the most respected financial commentators in the city, has been for a long time. He's one of the people to, if you can have a good financial crisis, he had a good financial crisis because he saw a lot of this coming. His book, which has come out recently, his most recent book, is Uprising, which is about how the balance of the world economy is changing. Follows on from a previous book of his called The Age of Aging, which asked me big and interesting questions about how demographics are changing the world. Uprising is interesting insofar as it's challenging, in a sense, our conventional view about how the balance of economic power is changing, and it asks in particular, some interesting questions about how robust China and China's economy really are. So in that sense, it's questioning the consensus. Gideon Rachman is Chief Foreign Affairs Columnist at the Financial Times. Many of you will read his brilliant columnists. He's probably one of the most experienced people in that kind of journalism. He was previously Brussels correspondent for the FT, for the Economist rather. He was at the BBC World Service. He's had, like Forrest Gump, an uncanny knack of always being in the right place at the right time for major world events.
The same intellectual.
But you have been there and seen it, and his book, which is for sale at the back of the room, Zero Sum World, is interesting. It gives us a sort of a history of how diplomatic arrangements in the world got to where they are today. And it talks about the era of optimism, really, between the end of the Cold War and I think you date it to 2008, the end of it, and the challenges now to that age of optimism we thought we were in, from authoritarian powers like Russia and China to fractured states like Afghanistan and Pakistan, and new global challenges like global warming. So, in a sense, books talking about slightly different things, but with strong overlaps. So some of you will have heard the two of them on the Today programme. They seem to be sort of now yoked together as an item. They're on a sort of global tour. But of course, many overlaps, the interesting difference of perspective between these two books, particularly about the future of China, I think. So both of them are going to give us a sense of their arguments to start with, and then we're going to have some time for questions and answers. So it's a huge pleasure to have you both here this evening. And we're going to start with Gideon. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, Neil, for that kind introduction. As you say, George and I have somehow been twinned. I think our books must have come out at the same time, and they do in fact overlap. So, but my argument is really about how the economic crisis has changed international politics, and the reason it's called Zero Sum World is that if you had to summarise the argument in a line or two, and I'm told that is what one has to be able to do. It's that in the period before 2008, we were in an international system which was defined by globalization, and where all the world's major powers were essentially content with the way the world was working for them. And in that sense, it was a win-win world for the big powers, the China's, the US, the European Union, and so on. But that the international financial crisis and the economic crisis that followed it have changed the logic of international relations and moved us into something that's more a zero-sum world, by which I mean it looks more like a world in which the gains in power for rising powers like China look like they're coming at the economic and political expense of the established powers in the West, and particularly the United States. And that there's also an outbreak of zero-sum logic here within the European Union, where an organisation that was built around a sort of win-win logic of shared prosperity and greater global political cooperation is now prone to infighting and with the risk of collapse even. The argument of the book, as Neil said, goes back into history. And that's because I think that globalization, although we've thought about it as essentially a kind of economic phenomenon to do with more trade, more investment, that kind of thing, was also a profoundly political event. It was brought about by a series of political changes, and it shaped international politics. It shaped the way that countries related to each other. And I think it's helpful actually to look back at that part response and to see how we got to the point we were at in 2008. In the book, what I do is I divide the period into two. So what I call an age of transformation from 78 to 91, and then an age of optimism from 91 to 2008. Transformation because I think from 78 to 91, we saw, in retrospect, the creation of the modern globalized world that we were used to, that we're now used to. So that in 1978, we thought about the advanced capitalist world. It was really a pretty small group of countries. It was the US, Western Europe, Japan, G7 countries. By 91, however, all the world's major powers are participating in a globalized economic system. That's because of a series of linked political changes in country after country. The first, the most significant change happens in China in 1978 with the coming to power of Deng Xiaoping and his reversal of Maoism, which was closely related to an effort to revivify the Chinese economy by plugging it into the global economy, and with consequences that we now know were world-shaking, although at the time it wasn't at all apparent that that was what was happening. So the Chinese change was the first and the most significant, but then there were a series of other events. In the West, you have a resurgence of free market ideology, with Thatcher coming to power in 1979, Reagan coming to power in 1980, and effort to revive the European Union through the creation of the single market in 1986, which again is sort of associated with globalization. It's about breaking down barriers to trade and investment and so on. Then the most dramatic event of that period is 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, when the half of Europe that had been sealed off from the capitalist democratic world rejoins it with the collapse of the Soviet Empire. There's also, throughout the 1980s, a transformation in Latin America. In 79, there were just, I think, 3 democracies in Latin America. By the end of the 80s, most of the continent has gone democratic, and that is linked to an opening up of those countries to the global economy. And then 1991, a year that somehow doesn't quite have the resonance of 1989, but was, I think, in some ways just as significant, because that's 3 things happened in that year. You have the final collapse of the Soviet Union, Soviet flag lowered at the Kremlin for the last time towards the end of that year. You also have the opening of India, which is the last major power to join the globalization game. They'd followed autarkic, kind of protectionist economic, socialist economic policies really since independence in 48. By 91, they're near economic collapse. Manmohan Singh, now Prime Minister, but then Finance Minister, comes in and persuades the Indian government that they have to really emulate the other rising economic powers of Southeast Asia, South Korea's, Japan's, etc., and go for a more globalized economic policy. And so the second kind of Asian giant joins the globalization game. And the last event of 91 is the first Gulf War, because that, in a sense, that's not about globalization, but what it is about is the resurgence of American power and a rediscovery by the United States that it can use its military in a way that it had not really thought possible in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. So, in a very short period, 13 years, you get this transformation of the world. Then you have what I call the age of optimism from 91 to 2008. By that I mean, this is a period when all the world's major powers, for slightly different reasons, have reason to be content with the way the world's working. The US, because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, is in its unipolar moment. It's the core of the global political system, the core of the global economy. Under Clinton, it has its longest peacetime expansion since 1945. And also there's a rediscovery of American confidence in their own business acumen, if you like, because Japan, which they've been worrying about enormously in the late 80s, goes into a long dip, no longer seems a plausible rival. And Silicon Valley is discovered with the rise of Microsoft's, Apple's, Google's, etc. America, once again, seems to be the creative hub of the world, as well as its foremost economic and political power. And for that reason, America is able to take a pretty relaxed view of the rise of China, something that under other circumstances might have been rather alarming to the world's established power, the growth of this enormous country that's growing at 8 to 9% a year. But the Americans, who have a renewed sense of confidence in free market and democratic ideology after the end of the Cold War, more or less on both sides of the political aisle, Republicans and Democrats, successive presidents, believe that China will, in time, somehow meld into a kind of Americanized world. There's almost a confusion between Americanization and globalization. In that period, I think the Americans come to think the two terms are almost synonymous. The world is becoming more like America, and that if China doesn't become more like America, doesn't democratize, and that it will fail economically. That's something that you hear all the time in the United States, because capitalist values will bring democratic values, and if they don't bring democratic values, capitalism will fail. That's the sort of syllogism that allows America to accept the rise of China. So the Americans have an optimistic take on the world. The Chinese, after the shock of Tiananmen Square, are also very confident about the transformation of their country, which they can see happening. The economy's doubling in size every 7 years at the rate that China's growing. India rediscovers itself, the rise of Bangalore, the new companies, the sense that India, which had been left out of the kind of Asian economic boom, now really is an emerging economic and political power. And this is also a period of confidence in the European Union. The EU almost more than doubles in size from 12 countries in '95 to 27 now. It launches the euro, an act of enormous confidence, this unprecedented experiment. And so for different reasons, as I say, all the world's major powers have reason to buy into globalization, to feel that it's something that's working well for them. Then I think you have the economic and financial crisis of 2008, and it becomes apparent, and I think it's still unfolding, that that has changed the way that countries relate to each other. Largely because as it unfolds, it becomes clear that it's affected the West much worse than it's affected the Chinas and the Indias and so on. The United States is stuck with unemployment that's still 9.1%, soaring budget deficit, and very little sense of how they can bring it under control. And a growing sense that can America really afford to be a superpower anymore? That the military budgets on which this is dependent will come under strain as the budget, the US government budget, has to be cut back one way or another. A growing sense that China is actually perhaps more threatening, the rise of China is more threatening than America had thought before 2008. The European Union, I don't need to remind you, is in its own debt crisis and euro-related crisis, turning inward, feeling more protectionist, rise of populist political movements within the EU itself. We too are in a defensive mode. And yet, for the moment at least, but George may cast some doubt on this, but it looks as if the emerging powers, that China preeminently, but also India, Brazil and others, that's where economic and political power are heading. So to finish off, I think that in that new context you get, which is primarily initially economically, you get a new set of political relations which inevitably are raising tensions in the world. I'd look primarily at three areas. The first is US-Chinese relations, which I think is now the most important political relationship in the world, and the way that, increasingly the way that US-Soviet relations defined the world during the Cold War. It's a more complex relationship in the US-Soviet relationship because it's not primarily adversarial. It has strong elements of cooperation even now. But I think that the adversarial elements are increasing, and you can see it economically, you can see it diplomatically, you can see it strategically. Economically, there's more and more of a discourse in America saying that there's something fundamentally unhealthy about the US-Chinese economic relationship, an argument that Chinese currency policy is actually undermining American competitiveness, leading to the loss of American jobs, and not just from the usual suspects, trade unionists and so on. You hear it even from Nobel Prize winning economists like Paul Krugman, who's come up and said that a tariff on Chinese goods would be justifiable given Chinese currency policy. Diplomatically, the US has found that in various arenas it's finding it harder to get its way because China's been surprisingly adept at blocking them. For example, the Copenhagen climate talks, which eventually ended up as a kind of standoff between the US and China. America, I think, had hoped that the world's democracies would stand with it, but in fact, in the final shakedown, India, Brazil were closer to the Chinese side than they were to the US side. And strategically, there is a growing sense of military rivalry in the Pacific, and that is inevitable because, in a few years' time, perhaps by 2019, according to The Economist, China will be the world's largest economy, but America is still a preeminent military power in the Pacific, and there is a mismatch between that, and that, I think, will be a source of tension in years to come. The second area I look at is the European Union. I mentioned that before, and I think it's interesting because the EU was a sort of mini globalization. The logic of globalization, that we do things together economically, we become more prosperous together economically, and that has positive political spin-offs, was really the logic that the EU was built on. But in a new economic crisis, that logic's sort of gone into reverse, so that in bad economic conditions, actually, it leads to increasing political tensions. And a project that was really all about binding Germany into Europe, solving the German problem once and for all, is now actually leading to enormous acrimony between Germany and the debtor nations of Europe, the Portugals, the Greeces, the islands, and so on, and potentially threatening the signature project of the European Union, the single currency. Third and final area to look at, and then I'll hand over to George, is global governance, because I think one of the byproducts of globalization is an increasing realization that there's a set of global political problems that no one country acting alone can solve, whether it's climate change or it's global economic imbalances or nuclear proliferation. There aren't really national solutions to these problems. Global leaders tend to agree that they need to find some sort of international solution to these things, but in multilateral forum after multilateral forum is finding itself blocked, whether it's the World Trade Organization talks and the inability to complete the Doha round, whether it's a failure to complete climate change negotiation in Copenhagen, whether it's the inability to find a sanctions package that actually contains the Iranian nuclear program. We're not getting there in these attempts to find international cooperative solutions. And I think that's because of these underlying rivalries that I talked about, the growing rivalry between the US and China as a subset of the growing rivalry between established Western economic powers and emerging Asian and Latin American economic powers, and the lack of political structures to somehow mediate those rivalries, added to the fact that because the US is no longer the sole superpower, it finds it much harder to kind of bang the table and say, okay guys, this is how it's going to be, because there's now resistance to American-led solutions. They don't have the power to impose, but nobody else has the power to cast or to create a new way of doing things, and that's why we're currently stuck in so many international fora. So it's an unstable international political situation. It's not, I think, one that is likely to lead to war between the major powers. It would be relieved to know, for the same reason we didn't have wars in the Cold War, because it's just too dangerous in a nuclear age. But it does have all sorts of other difficult political effects, which I think could erode globalization. But that's a whole other thought, which perhaps I'll leave for the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, I've actually got some prepared remarks here, which is sometimes a bit limiting, but they give me the opportunity also to swiftly move on from issues that I've mentioned here, which Gideon actually almost lifted word for word. Not deliberately, of course, it's just really thinking about things the same way. Uprising, which has a subtitle, Will Emerging Markets Shape or Shake the World Economy, is really about the situation that Gideon's described, which is about the emergence of several emerging, or obviously major countries, the BRICS economies and several others besides, in economic and financial and technological terms, and basically ask the question specifically about how this will change the world. Obviously it will shape it in many, many, hopefully meaningful ways, but also how it might shake it, and shake it in some of the ways that Gideon's kind of alluded to. The conclusion of the book actually does have a chapter on the New World Order as it happens, and so I'm just going to kind of pick up on that, since that's obviously the title of this evening's talks. So the previous Prime Minister, as you may recall, said after the April G20 in 2009, I think a new world order is emerging with the foundation of a new progressive era of international cooperation. Now, he wasn't the first nor the last to say things like that. And many have attributed, as I think both Gideon and I do, the shake-up in the global system to the enormity of the crisis with long-lasting consequences, not just for us in the developed world, but in the emerging world as well. The good news, I suppose, is that we haven't revisited, at least yet, to any significant degree, the very dark anti-liberalism that erupted in the aftermath of the last major financial crisis in the 1930s. In fact, if anything, the West, obviously, is having to reboot its ideas about markets, regulations, and governance, which is a bad thing, whilst a lot of emerging countries have grafted Western with a small w, models of prosperity a la carte onto their own development template. So I think that gives us cause, to some degree, to be hopeful. But if the New World Order rests on Gordon Brown's progressive era of international cooperation, I think it's unfortunately premature, to say the least, and possibly excessively optimistic. If anything, I think events since April 2009 testify to a new world disorder. Though, to be sure, as we've already heard, the financial crisis has acted as a huge catalyst and has accelerated the decay in the old order. But of course, as Gideon's outlined, the phenomenon predates the financial crisis by a considerable period of time. So what I think has really been going on, actually, probably from the time which you just heard Gideon say, which is from 1978, Deng Xiaoping, economic pragmatism, I don't care if it's a black cat or a white cat, so long as it's a cat that catches mice. That was attributed to him at a party conference a couple of years before he actually came to power. Something else is obviously going on, which is basically called the Great Economic Reconvergence. I say reconvergence rather than convergence because for perhaps a millennium or more, certainly until the middle of the 18th century, China, according to all accounts, was the hub of the global system. And while, if you've read the book by Ian Morris about why the West rules for now, human development sometimes went faster in the West, sometimes faster in the East, nothing compared with what happened in terms of the divergence of wealth and well-being since about 1750. So this divergence has clearly now ended. And what we're witnessing today is nothing less than the reversal of the primary trend that obtained for the best part of 250 years. So, to me, or for me, the development of a new world order has three key features. It's inevitable, it's based around multipolarity, and it's unpredictable because I think you can't have, well, this may be contentious, but you can't have a stable world order in the absence of a benign global hegemon, willing and able to provide leadership and get others to gather around, or most to gather around an agenda. And unfortunately, for now at least, America's willingness and ability are both compromised as a result of the crisis, and China, I think, lacks it. So the financial crisis unquestionably has fractured the Washington consensus and rendered the US vulnerable, not just to dysfunctional politics, but also to financial strangulation of the very strengths which reside in its military supremacy, higher education system, and its capacity for R&D and innovation. Whether or not the US will be able to meet these challenges in the future will surely define its role in the global system. But I'm not sure whether the epitaph, RIP, actually stands for rest in peace or renewal in progress. I think we'll just have to wait and see. But while we ponder this, we also obviously have to ask whether the new Beijing consensus will become the shape of the new world, or whether it's simply a fanciful political, geopolitical notion that has narrow appeal and very strict limitations. It's quite clear that China is reaching out to emerging countries and less developed countries to challenge the US ideologically and politically. You can see this, for example, in the renaissance of the Silk Road, which is basically an establishment of bilateral rather than multilateral political and commercial interests stretching from Central Asia through the Middle East to Africa and Latin America. You can see it in China's attempts to try to reform international financial governance and specifically to lessen its and the world's dependence on the US dollar at its heart. You may have read a lot about the internationalization of the RMB and the growth of offshore trading in China's currency for the purposes of trade settlement and raising of capital. I mentioned here actually that the internationalization of the RMB is one of the slowest trains on the planet. It was first mooted probably back at the beginning of the 1990s. It was supposed to be done and dusted by 2000. Now it's supposed to be by 2020. Well, you can tell from my tone of voice that I'm quite skeptical about the willingness of China to basically cede control over the movement of capital by its citizens in particular, certainly as long as the CCP remains in charge. Clearly, China's development into the largest economy in the world is on course, and it's going to be greeted with much fanfare. I'm not convinced it's of enduring relevance, to be honest, nonetheless. Yet, I think China could become a major world leader in the sense that we understand it, based on 5 important features. The first is China's very strong geographical attributes. The second is that having consolidated the integration of the internal economy, it now means that it can project external commercial interests and strategic interests. Thirdly, it's the world's biggest creditor nation, though that's not always a good thing. Remember America in the 1920s and Japan in the 1980s. Fourthly, it's certainly big enough to have a very material impact on the global economy and to demand or to expect cooperation from partners. And lastly, it is a major consumer and participant in world energy markets and certainly has a potential to be a top dog in technology. However, I do think that there's a serious danger of over-extrapolation and of misunderstanding, which leads me to make 5 other points to set against what I've just cited. The first of these is that the transition from being a poor country in 1978 to being borderline middle income today is quite different from the challenge that China faces over the next 10 years, during which time its income will probably treble again from about $4,000 per head to about $13,000. And this is going to be, I think, altogether much more demanding than the last 20 years and require radical changes to create economic, legal, and political institutions necessary for sustained economic success. And they become more important, these institutions, as you get richer. So far more important than GDP or steel consumption, electricity output or home ownership or whatever you want to kind of measure. It's much more important to look at the quality of the institutions which are there to nurture this next stage of development. Remember, there are many countries that basically have been in this position before and got caught in what we call a middle income trap. These countries include most of Latin America and also the former USSR up to about 1982, 1983. So the problem is that it's very difficult to jump over what I call the brick wall, pardon the expression, if you don't have the quality of institutions necessary to basically carry you into the rich or the higher income league. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be a democracy, but we have no templates to know whether that's possible or not. Secondly, China's existing institutions, especially its legal institutions, embed important constraints that hinder innovation, real innovation, trust and confidence in commerce, top-drawer higher education establishments and sophisticated capital markets. These constraints have been very evident in a whole series of governance failures, which range from food and product safety, pharmaceutical and chemical safety, occupational safety, human trafficking, and environmental degradation. And note the links between these phenomena and the growing incidence of social unrest, not organised and therefore possibly not dangerous, but then if you look at the way in which the Chinese establishment has cracked down on human rights protesters, human rights lawyers, the Jasmine demonstrations, so-called, what does that tell you about their security, their sense of security? Thirdly, the essential strategy of rebalancing what is a chronically unbalanced economy over the next several years is certainly enshrined in the new 12th five-year plan. But success here doesn't depend so much on ticking off a series of economic boxes and moving on to the next thing, as on a profound political transformation, taking power away from people that have accumulated in the last 25 years and giving it away to people that don't have it. And this doesn't sit comfortably, I think, with the raison d'etre of the CCP as it is, or with the princelings who are now manoeuvring to take over next year. Fourthly, on a still shorter horizon, the next 2 or 3 years, I think the issue of financial stability is likely to emerge. So China and most of the other emerging world got through the crisis partly because they'd had that crisis in the Asian crisis of 1997-1998, which was devastating, not so much for China, but for most of the emerging world. And they had many years to kind of get over it and establish new financial regulation, clean up balance sheets, and so on. But this is all starting to go a little bit pear-shaped, and the risks of overinvestment, of excessive reliance on credit, and the handmaiden, which is rising bad debts and non-performing loans, is beginning to become more significant. And fifthly, for reasons which we might go into, and I think Gideon knows more about this than I do, since certainly 2009, China has demonstrated much greater sensitivity to local unrest and to anything in the international sphere or the regional sphere that threatens or seems to threaten its sovereignty. At a time when there's been a growing intrusion by the army, by state-owned enterprises, by regional political elites into foreign and economic policy making. So you sometimes get this impression of, are they doing this because they feel very strong, or are they doing this because they feel very weak? And it's kind of an incoherent status quo as things stand at the moment. So my sense is that whatever the world might look like in 2050, it's far too early to call time in asserting the inevitable rise of China to global dominance. Richer, yes, global dominance I think is another issue. And perhaps equally inevitable, as people sometimes say, the decline of the West, which, as you may be familiar, was first cited by Oswald Spengler back in 1918 in the wake of the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, but which also has now rationalized decline in Germany and the West as part of an impersonal world historical process, some of which I think is based on truth. That clearly is happening. So, a couple of concluding comments. Despite China's increasing engagement in the world, trade, globalization and so on, historical rivalries in Asia, and quite recently, incidents of resentment and distrust involving Japan, India, Korea, Vietnam, and the Philippines, and further afield actually remind us that the foundations of political alliances and supremacy in China remain much shallower than they sometimes appear on the surface. So these pieces of this new world order, I guess, are in flux really. The ground is shifting, but to kind of echo what you've already heard, the structures aren't really in place. We have a multipolar economic system, but without strong leadership and governance institutions to nail those very high levels of cooperation needed to manage all the issues that we now need to be sorted out, from nuclear proliferation to food and water issues, energy, climate change and so on. Certainly I think this reconvergence is the basis for a different and constructively competitive new world order, but again, without adequate institutions and leadership, it's not quite clear how these pieces are going to settle. We're all feeling, whether you're in developed countries or in emerging countries, many of us are feeling more insecure, more introspective, more concerned about domestic instability, unrest and disruption. And this basically means that we suppress the willingness to subordinate our sovereignty and national interest to global well-being. Income inequality, the need for economic rebooting and the sovereign crisis obviously haunt the US and Europe. And economic rebalancing, also income inequality, and inflation and political reform also constitute sources of instability for China. So I guess we're struggling with these new challenges that include governance of financial globalization, social policies and protection, the role of industrial policy, food and water and all that kind of, all those kinds of issues, which partly arise from this reconvergence and the strengthening of the economic power in the emerging countries, and partly from some of the issues, particularly as we regard food and water and commodities from climate change. So if a new world order is to emerge in the aftermath of this crisis, and we're to avoid the possibility of another damaging recession in or soon after 2013, I think international cooperation has to make a pretty big or giant leap forward soon, and hopefully with success. Thank you.
Gideon and John, a fantastic presentation. It's a huge amount to think of there, and I'm impressed by the sweep of both of your kind of views. If you want to say who you are and where you're from, you put your hands up if you have a question. There are some roving mics as well. Gentlemen, here in the front row.
Mohammed Amin from the Conservative Muslim Forum. Going back to your question about global governance structures, would it be a step forward for the UK and France to give up their veto permanent membership of the Security Council in place and replace it with the European Union membership?
So, Neil, as a former Eurosceptic, I'm sure current Eurosceptic, I think I should get you to answer that one. But look, logically, it's very hard to argue against. I can see why the British, and I think the British and French governments are understandably hypocritical of this. They say they're all in favour of it, that's the Foreign Office line, but they know that the way the politics work, it's highly unlikely to happen. And the reason being that as soon as you start playing fantasy UN Security Council, you run into the political difficulties. So it would seem obvious, for example, that India should join. But you know, that would the Chinese don't see it as that obvious. Same with Japan. I mean, until recently, the two that everybody would have added were Japan and Germany. They're not going to drop their claims, but now that looks a bit passé, and perhaps it should be India and Brazil. Brazil, well, you know, to us it seems like the obvious representative of Latin America. It certainly doesn't seem that way to Spanish-speaking Latin America. And it's always actually the country that's the next in the queue that blocks it. So when the biggest opposition to German membership of the UN Security Council came from Italy. And so it's sort of quite comfortable for the Brits and the French to say, yeah, absolutely, we agree this should happen. But, you know, and then just let the politics play out and block it. As to the specific question of an EU seat, actually, I hate to say this, the person who made the most coherent case I've heard for regional blocs being represented at the UN Security Council was Colonel Gaddafi. In a speech, long rambling speech to the UN General Assembly that I watched in 2008, his translator actually fainted. He was going on so long. But in the midst of all of this, he actually said, you know, this is crazy, we should have the African Union, we should have the European Union, the US, perfectly logical, but not going to happen. I mean, but for legal reasons, if nothing else, there is no actual mechanism for recognizing regional blocks, and you might think that's a kind of technical thing that you would fix, but once you get into it, it's a bit of a nightmare. And as a result, I think because UN Security Council reform has been so impossible to achieve, you've got the G20 forming, rather you've got a kind of new organisation. And people put a lot of hope into that, and I think it did deliver, it helped to stabilise the system in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis, partly because that's a relatively uncontroversial area, economic cooperation, although it's not, it is controversial, but it's not nearly as difficult as the big political issues. But I think as the G20 has sort of bedded in, it's become clear that that too is not a solution, partly because the powers there are unwilling to cede it, the legal powers that the United Nations has, and in the end, if you're going to get things like climate change or whatever on the move, you can't just do it through cooperative agreements that people can violate. There has to be some legal force behind it. The G20 will never have that legal power. And partly because the inherent rivalries within the G20 are beginning to emerge, and partly because it can't really yet move beyond economics, because once you get onto questions of sovereignty, questions of democracy, etc., then the rivalries between China in particular, and the Western powers become impossible to handle, so they just keep them off the agenda. So I'm afraid, yeah, I think an EU seat on the Security Council would be a logical step, but I can't really see it happening, and it's part of this broader problem of a breakdown in global governance.
Well, I don't think I've got anything to add to that. I agree with everything.
But Neil, I want to hear, what do you think about the EU seat on the Security Council?
I was actually, the only thing I would say is maybe we should reserve judgment until we actually find out what the European Union actually is going to look like in 5 years' time.
I was actually going to push you a little bit on this, because you have this thesis that something has changed in 2008, so it's more difficult to do some of these things. But has it really? So in 1991, the European Union couldn't get it together to deal with Yugoslavia, and 2011 it can't get together with Colonel Gaddafi, so we have coalitions that are willing on as not. And in the age of optimism that you talk about, 1994, the US can't change Somalia. These days, you might say that we're bogged down in various places around the world. So has anything really that much changed between the age of optimism that you talked about and the age that we're now in post-2008? It's not China that's stopping the US from solving some of these problems.
No, I mean, fair point on particularly on the kind of whole approach to failed states and intervention. And so, some were arguing we were actually making progress, and that Libya was a sign that a new doctrine was emerging. I think Syria will perhaps show that that new doctrine was more fragile than we thought. What I would say is that there's a bunch of, it depends what issue you're talking about. I think on those intervention has been a very difficult issue. I would argue that although you're right, it's been very difficult, it's going to get only more difficult because the Russians and the Chinas, the countries that are gaining power, have an ideological objection to interventionism, which adds to the practical difficulties that always existed. And then I think that on the kind of international areas that made globalization possible, particularly trade, you do see a beginning of a breakdown there. You know, we did get the gap to the WTO and so on, and the Doha round really is going nowhere. And so I think we're lucky to avoid a rollback, really, rather than any big advances. I don't know what George thinks.
I think two things actually have changed. I mean, quite fundamentally. The first is that in respect of China, that in particular, though other emerging countries too, it has changed from being a consumer to a competitor. So you alluded to this a little bit before, but during the 80s and during the 90s, it was generally assumed that China was just a massive market that was consuming Western products and technologies and so on. But clearly that's all changed, so it's now perceived very differently. It's a competitor, it's a rival, and in many cases an adversary. And I think that's a material change in the relationship. Whereas, or whilst I would say, as far as the European Union is concerned, there may always have been an existential problem with the foundation of the Eurozone as it is. Perhaps we should talk about Eurozone rather than European Union. But clearly the crisis has exposed that to the full, and I think that whatever happens to Greece's debt and all that stuff, that's not really going to address the issue, which is about the institutions and the mechanisms which the European or the Eurozone needs to become viable.
Maybe the third row, and then the gentleman towards the back.
Hi, I'm Maya Jolson from America. I work at UBS Bank. If you can talk a little bit about, do you think that China's kind of accession in WTO was a big, that catapulted China really to be the #2 world power? How important was that? And also if you can talk more about the Middle East and where you see those alliances and the role of, just the Middle East as a power itself, or as not a lack of a power.
I'll take the first bit. Well, I think WTO accession was absolutely crucial. I mean, for a country that's based its development model on, a form of mercantilism and on a strategy that has eventually ended up with China becoming the world's biggest export nation. Obviously, freer trade. I mean, it's not completely what you think it is, but actually, clearly, the change for China has been very, very important. It's not the only thing that mattered at all, of course, and on its own, it would make no kind of sense without real changes in the way in which state capitalism has come to operate in China so efficiently. But it was critical. And I think that's why this sort of currency spat that keeps cropping up, between the Americans and the Chinese. And it is a bit of a red herring, actually. That's not really the issue. And I think if politicians get obsessive about it, which might include, by the way, I mean, if the Congress were able to brand China a currency manipulator, which is a piece of legislation that comes to the Congress over years, regularly turned away so far, then the Congress, I think, would be empowered certainly to take China directly to the WTO and demand sanctions. So this is it's kind of a little bit of chicken on both sides, but it is very important. It's obviously very important to maintain an open trading system, which I think China is very, very well aware of.
So on the Middle East, I mean, I think that certainly, in the year since I finished the book, that's been the biggest geopolitical development is the Arab Spring, and I've been trying to work out, well, how does it fit into this sort of intellectual framework that I tried to lay out? And I think, well, for the moment, it's too soon to tell. If things go well, you could fit it into the narrative of what I call the age of optimism, where you saw an economic and political convergence in the world around free markets in the economic sense and spread of democracy, so that Fukuyama's famous End of History, which was essentially about the triumph of democracy, came out in '89 and looked fairly prescient for a while. But the Middle East was always a big exception to that. That was the one part of the world which seemed to be relatively immune to the spread of democracy. Now, if the Arab Spring does, after a bit of turmoil and strife, lead to democratic governments in the Middle East, which then plug into the globalized world in ways that the Arab world, other than the oil industry, haven't really done very successfully, then you could actually see that resurgence of that narrative of the age of optimism. However, if it goes the other way and you have turmoil in Egypt, rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, economic collapse, and I must say, I was there recently, and the economy certainly is looking pretty bad, and I don't think the politics look very promising in the short term, at least. But also, Egypt and Tunisia look like the first two dominoes, but they may be the only two dominoes if the Syrians manage to repress the movement there, if the Iranians cling on, the Gulf clamps down, and so on. You could then actually have the Middle East fitting more the narrative of what I call the late period, 2008, on age of anxiety, where one of the chapters in the book is about the threat of more failed states in a more economically pressurized environment of rising food prices, resource wars, globalization of media, and so on, where rather than looking more like sort of Western Europe, like the other side of the Mediterranean, these countries look more like, say, Pakistan, countries that are in a chronic state of crisis, unable to find a stable government, poised somehow between dictatorship and failing democracy, and a source of continuing militancy and international problems. And it's too soon to say which way they'll go. I think either scenario is plausible.
Gentleman, right in the back.
James Woodhouse, and I'm Professor of Forecasting at De Montfort University. I have a question for both of you, or two questions really, which you might care to comment on. One of the things that's being globalized at the moment, I think, is the globalization of dumb agendas, politically, and also in something that you mentioned, R&D. So in March of this year, we saw Wen Jiabao and the Chinese Communist Party upholding the idea of a China Gross National Happiness Index, I think that they got from David Cameron, and before that, the Nudge authors. And then conversely, perhaps a bit more seriously, not in political terms, but in R&D, you see Jeffrey Immelt and General Electric saying, if we can make X-ray machines through our Indian labs that will work during power cuts, why don't we adopt the same product strategies in the West? In other words, that although no doubt it serves a function in India, whether it's the function that you would like it to serve in the West, because you predicate it on the fact that we can't do anything about power cuts, is a dumbing down of the agenda in R&D. I think China's technological supremacy is not guaranteed, but it's certainly potentially there. I agree with George. But I think two things that have changed since the age of optimism is this globalization of silly ideas and also of rather silly approaches to technological innovation.
So we're exporting their crap technology and they're exporting our silly ideas.
The other way, they're importing
our silly ideas. Well, at least we're still a world leader in that.
Is there a wider point there about this sort of globalization, the speed of the spread of ideas? Everyone goes to the same meeting because they all...
Yeah, I mean, to some extent. I mean, I think we were a bit blind, actually, about how irresistible Western ideologies were going to be. I mean, one of the reasons I talked about the Americans being fairly cheerful about the rise of China, I think it's because they sort of thought that YouTube, etc., were irresistible forces that they would just kind of sweep all before them. That if there was a Starbucks in the Forbidden City, that told you something about the durability of the Communist Party, and it probably didn't. But I mean, I don't have a full answer to James' questions, but on the technology issue, I've actually visited the GE labs in Bangalore and in Shanghai, and one interesting thing is the extent to which big American multinationals like GE and Microsoft are putting so much of their research effort now into Asia. I mean, they will have a big R&D lab, of course, in the US and in Europe, and then there'll be one in India and China. I think both Microsoft and GE have that pattern. And they are trying to develop appropriate technologies for those areas, and then perhaps bringing them back if they're useful. I don't really, if they're preparing for an age of mass power cuts in Europe, that is a bit depressing. But on the other hand, actually, MRI machines are, my wife actually works in that area, and we have these very, very whizzy, high-tech MRI machines that are very expensive to develop. They've developed cheaper models for the Indian market simply because the throughput of patients has to be that much higher, hospitals are that little bit less rich. And actually they're thinking, well, maybe they could bring those back to the West because we have increasing demand for this kind of technology. That seems to me entirely fruitful kind of cross-fertilization.
On the first point, slightly cynically actually, because you may be aware, of course, in 2006 the Chinese started publishing an alternative measure of GDP, which was supposed to be greener and more akin to, the kind of harmonious economy and all that kind of stuff. And they, it started in 2003 or 2004, but they shut it down in 2007 because it was starting to give them information that they really weren't very happy with. So they're unhappy. I mean, I don't think it's a completely silly idea in the sense that obviously GDP doesn't tell you everything you need to know about the quality of, output and the quality of economic life, but it'll be a long time before we start using these things if at all. The R&D and innovations lab. Now I'm quite kind of interested in this because there are quite clearly areas where in India and China, Brazil as well actually, that there are clearly a lot of leading global firms. So I think something like 20% of the Fortune 500 companies are already headquartered in emerging countries, mostly in China and Brazil. Clearly that is going to grow over time. But I think it's quite important to draw a distinction between what we might call kind of product development and what actually the CEO of GE is called reverse innovation, which is where they take a complex Western technology, dumb it down and make it cheaper because labor is cheaper, and then suddenly it becomes the standard for the world because it's more accessible and it's cheaper to use and so on. So I draw a distinction between that kind of stuff, which I think obviously a lot of emerging countries are quite good at, particularly in climate change technology, alternative energy exploration and so on. And what I call the real innovation, which is really the product of broad-based development across a wide range of products between bio, nano, information technologies, and the very sophisticated kind of top-tier, whatever the next kind of technological breakthroughs will be, which actually I think will really be, they do stay in the United States and in Germany, and do they stay here? I don't really know. Probably in some areas we're quite good. So I think there is that distinction. So you can be very good at technology, and you can be very good at replication and reverse innovation, but that doesn't mean that you're really good at innovation as such.
Can I just make that very quick? I mean, I think that's a key question. I wonder whether the debate's over yet. Again, I slightly wonder whether we in the West have sort of comforted ourselves with the thought that, well, this is one area that's going to be ours, and the Chinese, clearly, they can't do that because they don't have these creative cultures, or they're undemocratic, and in some way that will crimp their ability to develop technologies. And it may be the case, but we've been surprised in other areas by how much kind of modern economic activity is compatible with an authoritarian political system, and I don't see particularly why, given the enormous number of engineers that are being turned out in both China and India, the high levels of education, why it's inconceivable that they actually might be able to do really quite cutting-edge R&D, which doesn't have very obvious political implications and can be done.
This is going to project just before this gentleman in the front row. A bit more on this kind of economically driven democratization type of argument, because George, when you were speaking, there was this sense that this argument might still apply, it's just that it hasn't kicked in yet as we get to the kind of a higher level of development. That was the issue. You said that the slowest train in the world was the currency peg moving. That might also be the process of democratization in China. is there anything there? People are saying, well, there are elections in the villages and things like that. Or are we just fooling ourselves? Is there anything going on?
No, well, I think, the point about, certainly from the point of view of technology, I think it is quite important, because clearly there are leading global companies that basically come from China in telecommunications, as I said, in solar power and wind power and so on and so forth, and even actually the hot kid on the block in terms of global technology, which is nano. I mean, there are scientists at Tsinghua University who have already kind of pioneered the development, from molecules of a range of products, from audio speakers to body armor. So nobody's saying that China can't do these things, can't achieve notable success in innovation and invention. And in fact, that never was not the case, if you think about it, in Chinese history. However, the point really is that I think that as the economy and as the society becomes more complex, as the importance of legal protection and neutral contract enforcement and property rights, including intellectual property rights, actually become more significant. Or, let's put it another way, if you don't have these things, I think it really will crimp the ability to become a top dog.
And there's the same as democracy. I mean, Singapore has all those things, but it's not. I mean,
it's a small city-state, which obviously some time ago took a very enlightened view about how it was going to kind of slot in. I think there's much less political than obviously is the case. By the way, I mean, I think you could say the same with Korea and Taiwan as well. But I think, I don't know, my sense is that in China there is still far too much political or arbitrary decision-making, which means that the entrepreneurial transformation, which is really what innovation kind of springs from, is blocked or restricted.
There was a first question here, and then there's another one over here, and the lady in the second row. Go there first.
Henry Elphick from Jefferies Investment Bank. A couple of questions. First is really on demographics. If you look at the convergence you're talking about Julian's economies, look at the demographic profiles, do you say in China, which has a single child policy, and India, or indeed a number of countries in Western Europe or the US, they're very, very different. So I just wonder what your thoughts were about what impact that has economically on that rate of convergence, or indeed if there is that convergence. And secondly, recently there's been a hot topic about onshoring, the fact that we've got escalating, for example, employment costs in China, whether the desires of the Immels of this world, the Obamas, the Camerons, to rebuild the industrial bases of our Western economies actually leads to a lot of repatriation onshoring, or whether that's actually a misnomer.
Good questions both, and briefly. Yeah, I mean the difference between India and China, I mean, could not be more extreme when it comes to the demographics. China's age structure looks very similar to Germany in a way. It's clearly not the oldest country on Earth, but it's certainly the fastest aging. So by 2040, 2050, this is a glacial phenomenon. But by the middle of the century, China will be older on every demographic metric than the United States. Higher dependency ratio, higher proportion of over 65s, faster contraction of the labour force, and so on. So these things, may not have huge impact for the moment. But I'd say that by 2020, you'll start seeing some of the effects on trend growth. And already you can see the effect of the kind of unintended consequences of the one-child policy in terms of wage increases, because typically female labour goes from the farms to the factories and men to the construction sites, and China is running out of cheap female skilled labour. So this is part of the reason why wage rates are actually rising quite quickly now, which links to India, by the way, of course, totally different. 1/3 of the population is aged under 15. Provided they can all be found jobs as they mature into young workers, India has huge capacity to become, the big growth engine in the next 20 years. But the official unemployment rate in India is 7%. The unofficial rate, if you take into account poverty, is more like 27%. So as in, I mean, it's an extreme case, and I'm not saying India ends up like the Middle East, but there you have, real-time example of what happens to people whose aspirations for, rising living standards, jobs, education, frustrated and doesn't end quickly. So that's India's challenge, to create jobs. China's is to create, obviously, the financial infrastructure for its aging population. The rising wages, it is a factor, I think. I don't think it's a huge kind of surge in let's bring the business back home. Well, there are, as you're well aware, there are obviously instances where that's happening. And I think if doing or producing stuff in China becomes too expensive, companies can still go to Vietnam and Bangladesh, or there are other places where labor's cheap. But one thing that comes out in surveys of European and American companies that do business in China, and there's quite a lot of them, as you know, is that the cost is now beginning to act as a bit of an offset for things that they used to turn a blind eye to before, which is just the legal difficulties of doing business, piracy, ripping off product ideas and all this kind of stuff. So for a long time, I think companies were quite prepared to kind of turn a blind eye to it because labour was cheap and profits were great. But obviously, one of those important metrics starts to change, which is labour costs, then the other things could become influential.
It's a question right in front.
Yes, John Alexander Hamza. Could you comment on what is becoming apparently this increasing polarization of wealth between the very rich and everybody else that's happening in both the developed and the developing world? It's the idea that 1% of America owns 5% of the action, but it's being repeated across the piece.
Yeah, no, I'll have a quick crack at that. I mean, I think it is interesting, as you say, that that is a debate that in various forms occurs in China, concerns about inequality in India, where the Ambanis are building this crazy mansion in Mumbai and there's enormous poverty, but also here. My sense is that, looking at the figures, it's a more threatening phenomenon, or it's a more pronounced phenomenon in the West, in the sense that you have had stagnating real wages for the middle classes in the US, and this sort of sucking up of wealth into the top 1%. But it's also perhaps politically less threatening. I mean, it'll affect the way people vote eventually, although I'm surprised by how little it has actually. But because in these affluent societies where the difference is not sort of between starvation, it's not getting by the way you'd like to do, but it's not as offensive to see massive wealth if you're you're still able to feed your children and go to school. I think it's slightly less politically explosive than the perception of a wealth gap in, say, China, where even though the figures seem to show that large numbers of people are being dragged out of poverty, the people living in absolute poverty is declining, to the extent that it's accompanied by very ostentatious wealth at the top, even at the point where there's hundreds of million people still living at below $2 a day, and the wealthy are using that financial power to finance corruption, land grabs, etc. That is politically dangerous, and I think that you see it in the rhetoric of the Chinese leaders. That's one issue they are talking about a lot, is corruption, inequality, etc. So they try to manage it, but if I think it is a parallel between our societies. You create great globs of wealth at the top, that has a political effect, that translates into political power. So no matter how much you realise that it has to be counteracted, to some extent the rich in both societies, however different they are, will have political power that they use.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm an intern at Elliott. I had a question about China specifically. Given that they're so politically expedient, what is stopping them from reforming their legal systems and creating better institutions, which, I mean, there's a consensus that in terms of technology would clearly benefit them?
Can I have a quick go and then George? I mean, I think the thing is that it's very hard to do that and then to stop the knock-on political effects that threaten the Communist Party, because you might say, well, we want independent courts to arbitrate intellectual property disputes, but once you have judges who don't take orders, who just interpret the law, well, then you empower citizens, then you have a rival power block. This really is a one-party system in which, in the end, the party decides what happens. And if you have even independent courts, which you just want to deal with commercial things, which, Singapore is a sort of model for that. When it comes to politics, the courts aren't that independent. It's quite tough to ensure that you don't have these spillover effects into politics, and I think that would seem to me to be the inhibiting factor. The same with the media. You could say it would be great to have a free media that exposes corruption, that encourages open discussion, but where do you draw the line? What happens when they start straying onto things that you don't want to stray onto, which is why there's always a nervousness about it.
Yeah, and I think, the culture that mitigates against this kind of change that we think, we in the West think, they should make, actually is rooted in, millennia of Chinese history. I mean, the CCP may have shed its Marxism, but it's very Confucian, and the idea that the party, presides over the state, and the state in turn presides over the judiciary, is something that's very deeply rooted in Chinese society, and it conforms very much with the idea of harmonious society, which has been around since Confucius, which is really about the fact that power, kind of wisdom resides in the ruling elite, in the bureaucracy, and people do what they can to enhance the wisdom and the prowess of bureaucracy. So I think it's very difficult for them to change that. And I think if ever it got to the point where there was either social, where people actually said, okay, we've got our economic rights, but actually it's not enough now. We need something more than that. I think it would be very difficult for the CCP to give it away, and that actually would become quite a flashpoint. It's also going to be brought out, I think, during this decade, because the most important economic issue in China for the next 10 years is rebalancing. They know that the economy is unbalanced. They know they have to make changes. But as I said, before, you have to take money as power. You have to take money away from people that have accumulated power, or power away from accumulated money. So the cities, have done very well. Regional party elites have done very well. The coastal regions have been done very well. So where you need to shift the economic power now is inland, the countryside, the rural areas that have fallen badly behind. 780 million people still depend for their livelihoods in rural areas. And you have to basically take the power away from the regional and provincial governments. Those are huge political reforms that are required. So it's a question of political will, not incapacity.
There's Lillian Black in the fourth row there.
Kathy Finch from UBS. Earlier this year I travelled to Ethiopia and was really struck by the volume of Chinese construction companies and Chinese workers that I saw all over the country. And I was really interested to hear your thoughts about the implications of China's influence in Africa for the aid industry, and particularly for the traditional aid donors of the UK and the US.
Yeah, well, we should probably listen to you. I think you've been there and I haven't, but it's certainly a very kind of live issue in the aid world, partly because of this whole question of conditionality, that the conventional wisdom before the Chinese came along was that our mistake had been not to tie aid to governance reform, and that increasingly the World Bank and the bilateral donors, the Britain's USAID, would say, okay, well, you get this blob of money, but only if you do this, this, and this, including independent courts and so on. Now along come the Chinese, who are not interested in political conditionality, who tie it to aid to mineral deals generally, and we'll build you the infrastructure, a stadium, a road, or whatever, and you give us the copper, tungsten, whatever it is that we want to dig out of the ground. And that, because of the enormous sums of money involved, does undermine the Western effort to do it via governance, because why would you not take a larger amount of money from China with no strings attached, as opposed to this smaller amount of money from the West with strings attached? And clearly, it undercuts the whole Western approach to aid. That said, I was struck. We had a couple of years ago, Robert Zoellick, the head of the World Bank, through through the FT, and I asked him about this here, and expected him to say, yes, it's terribly worrying. I mean, this is a former Deputy Secretary of State, so he would also see it through the prism of American power. And he said, no, basically I think what China's doing is highly positive for Africa. They are building roads, they are changing the terms of trade so that African countries actually, are doing better economically. That's leading to faster growth. Of course, there are some difficulties, but overall, China's economic involvement and aid involvement in Africa is a big net positive. So that gave me pause but I didn't justify the kind of, oh well, it's all a disaster scenario.
Little to add, obviously, money in is obviously welcome money. The downside may be in some countries, there is a concern that actually, why do they have to bring Chinese labourers over here? We've got plenty of our own. And there has been a bit of a backlash in some countries. And I think Becky even talked a couple of years ago actually about beware the new colonialism and all this kind of stuff. So we'll see.
I met Kofi Annan at something. I was talking to him about this and said, what did he think? He said, oh, he basically thought it was fine until he was in a hotel room, I think, somewhere in Senegal. He said the TV remote control was in Chinese and he couldn't change the channel. He thought this has really gone too far.
Stripy shirt and then.
Hi, my name's Lee Redmond. I was just wondering, China have been consciously sort of promoting this image of a peaceful rise. I was wondering if you thought once they've actually risen, they will actually still remain status quo. How will this change?
Yeah, that's the key question, really. And you're right that that's their phrase, peaceful rise, and indeed they became worried that even peaceful rise sounded too threatening, so they changed it to something else like peacefulness. Peaceful anyway. And I think that the Western phrase that sort of was the flip side of that was again from Robert Zoellick, where he talked about China being a responsible stakeholder in the global system. And that was, I think, unconsciously condescending phrase, because essentially what he was saying is that we've constructed this global system, essentially the US in the aftermath of the Second World War, based around IMF, World Bank, and China can just join it basically without changing it. We'll give them a bit more power, more voting rights in the IMF maybe, but they're not going to change it. And I think that really is in question. And every now and then people say, well, what is China's vision for the global leader? What do they really want? And I don't think that they themselves really know. And I think even if they did know, they wouldn't tell us yet, because why should they? They're in the business of long-term accumulation of economic and political power, and their vision will become apparent, but we don't know what it is yet.
So just briefly, I mean, actually there's quite an interesting article in the recent edition of Foreign Affairs, actually, that's around this topic, highlighting a marked change in China's foreign policy since 2009. Whereas before, it had taken a number of constructive kind of initiatives, including in areas where it had been kind of vilified or criticised, like in Darfur and North Korea and so on. But since then, there's clearly been some sort of a shift. I mean, I don't know. This may have something to do with, as I said, the intrusion of different interest groups into the discussion and determination about foreign policy and economic policy as well. And the fact that what you end up with is sort of a public articulation of goals by Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, so these are technocrats, and by the liberal establishment, say in agencies like the People's Bank of China and so on. But actually amidst all of that, there are different opinions, and sometimes radically different opinions. And so it's very difficult, I think, for us to assert whether China is being assertive or whether actually it's feeling more and more concerned about its legitimacy. I don't think we know the answer to that, but the answer to your question depends on how they interpret that, I think.
Yeah, I could give you a snapshot of how the Americans saw it. Some of the Obama people came by the FT when he was here recently. And their view was that they like Hu Jintao and the people around him and regard them as trustworthy, and the National Security Council people saying, the people we deal with, everything they've promised us they'd delivered, you know, they're entirely reliable. But they see behind them a radicalization particularly led by forces within the People's Liberation Army who are pushing for more nationalistic policies. They think that there's a very live argument underway, and that towards the end of last year there was apparently a big piece by, I think it was Hu Jintao himself in the People's Daily, which was seen as an attempt by the leadership to kind of stamp down on the kind of new nationalism to reassert the old kind of more peaceful rise way of thinking. But as far as I think, as I understood it, as far as the Americans see it, they quite like the current leadership, but are a bit nervous of what's behind it, what may take its place.
I wrote down the industry forum. One question for Gideon and one for George. Gideon, I wonder if the age of optimism, with hindsight, isn't a misnomer, that given it was based on credit from China and a property bubble, which should probably be called a false paradox or something like that.
Yeah. Sorry, to do it afterwards.
Okay. George, about 3 months ago, I think Robert Peston said there were 85 million empty houses in China, and I kind of forgot that fact. And then last week, the FT said that last year, out of I think 500 million tons of steel produced in China, 2/3 went into property. And that does sound like, you know, a very significant bubble. And I wonder if you think there is the basis that the Chinese growth could actually come to an abrupt halt rather than a gradual decline.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think the thing about optimism is it's a mood, isn't it? And whether a mood is based on reality, you know, maybe the reason we're now in an age of anxiety is precisely because, I think that we're questioning the basis of that prosperity, and I think that question goes really quite high up, because I think that among Western leaders, the kind of Blair Clinton thinking, which was quite dominant, had an idea of a sort of informal global division of labour, in which it didn't really matter if manufacturing went east, because we would do the clever stuff, would be the ideas, all of that, and we'd do finance, all of that, that would work quite nicely. And then I think that, you know, with the questioning of the role of finance, with rise of unemployment in the West, you suddenly see Western leaders from Obama to Cameron saying, actually manufacturing really matters. That was not a fashionable view 5 years ago. And that's actually isn't just an economic statement, that has because it has implications for how we relate to those countries which have been grabbing all manufacturing. Are we still comfortable with that? And I think there is a rethinking of that.
And the other question is really the 64 trillion yuan question. Is China a bubble? There's no question. There are manifestations of bubbly activity which are largely localized and regional. So I don't know how many people haven't seen the YouTube video about the town of Ordos, which Robert went to as well. And you see the boulevards with no cars, and traffic policemen doing nothing, and real estate agents with no people in it, and all this kind of stuff. Loads of empty apartments. But I would say that I think at this point, unlike, it's quite fashionable amongst a lot of kind of well-known, high-profile investors to say, China's going bust and so on. I don't think there's any question that won't happen. Sorry, there's no question that it's going to happen in the near future, because, as I said, these are largely local problems. And why would that matter any more than the developers in Canary Wharf going bust when they did? I mean, didn't really kind of bring the UK to its knees. However, if you think about the dynamic of the latent demand for housing in China, much of the investment surge in the last 10 years has been in property. There's a huge housing shortage. People often misread this, because if they say, well, the urban population is, it's 85% home ownership, but actually that's not quite true, because 1/3 of the urban population live in poor quality housing, dormitories, transitory communities and so on. So there's huge demand for housing, very strong interest on the part of local and provincial governments to push property prices up, because they get 1/3 of their revenues from sales of land for urban development. And they're the monopoly suppliers of land. So there are too many people have too many interests in rising property prices. And although China has moved, again, totally aware of this. They've introduced pilot property tax schemes in Chongqing and Shanghai. They've raised the amount of deposit that you have to put down if you want to buy a flat or an apartment. So they have succeeded in bringing prices down, or price not down, but price inflation down. And yet, the biggest threat to China's financial stability and to the property market and to the investment output is really just rampant credit creation. And that's something, there's a lot of kind of dispute about, where are they and what are they doing and so on. So formal kind of loans by banks, they've been able to quash or to kind of temper quite significantly during the last year. But the whole, financial innovation wasn't something we just invented in the West. So off-balance sheet financing, special investment vehicles, these things are all present in China. And I think the issue will arise, I think, really after the leadership change next year. And then we'll see if the political will exist to really kind of clamp on it. I think it will, because inflation is socially divisive, but of course the other side of that is low growth is socially divisive too. So it's a very thin path.
Okay. We are just about to run out of time. I wondered if I could ask one last question, which is, we don't really have very many historical examples of transitions to democracy that don't involve military defeat or an economic crisis. Very hard to think of examples of just gradual shifts to democracy over time. So the question really is, can either of you see a gradual transition to democracy in China, and do both of you expect that in 20 years' time China will still be basically an authoritarian one-party state?
Well, I just said it was the 64 trillion one question. I don't want that. It's a big question. I'm not sure I agree that there have been no peaceful transitions to democracy. Actually, if you look, I think, around Asia, England, civil war, I suppose. But I mean, more recently in Asia, which might be more, opposite to modern conditions in China, South Korea, Taiwan. Sure, there was a bit of turbulence, but basically it was reasonably peaceful. I think the big question is whether China will follow that model. You could argue that they haven't yet reached the income per capita levels that triggered those changes in more prosperous societies like South Korea and Taiwan. Maybe they'll cross that threshold and there'll be a similar sort of development. I think the reason for fearing that it won't be that way in China is that China's history is that much more turbulent. The Communist Party is that much more kind of entrenched and ideological about the need for one-party control. I think there's also the fear that the state might begin to break up if it became democratic. And I think that is the biggest concern, sometimes unstated by the Chinese leadership, is what happens if you allow the Tibetans and the Uyghurs to have a free vote. I mean, within months you'd have separatist parties, and that's the big no-no in China. And for that reason, I think that there would be a nationalist backlash against democracy in China, and that's why they're so haunted by the breakup of the Soviet Union. They can see exactly what happened there, where you had national minorities breaking free. And so for those reasons, I think that it's much more difficult to envisage a peaceful transition to democracy in huge 1.3 billion unhomogeneous China, whatever they say about propaganda about one state and always been within its boundaries and so on. Actually, it is in a way an empire, and therefore will be threatened by democracy. And that's a big break really to its democratic development.
Yep. And I think it's a catch-22, which is I don't think there can be a kind of a peaceful transition to democracy in China. I do think the CCP probably, as things stand, will be in charge in 20 years' time, but then all the things that we think that China will be in 20 years won't be so, if that's the case, in my view.
I think I see. We are now, I'm afraid, completely out of time. George and Gideon, fascinating stuff, incredibly, just raised all these different interesting questions that we can sort of spend hours pursuing. Both your presentations have been both fascinating this evening, so it only really remains to say thank you very much.